All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I can see a few people still coming in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Sam Mello. I'm with the Sierra Sacramento Valley Medical Society and the Museum of Medical History. And tonight we have a wonderful lecture with Lynn Downey. But before we get to that, I'm going to introduce our curator of the museum, Dr. Bob LaPerriere. And just a note for tonight's session, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A, and we'll address them at the end. So without further ado, Dr. Bob, take it away.
Thank you, Sam. Welcome to our lecture. We're trying to get back to 3 or 4 a year like we used to do, including maybe one live one at the museum. Tonight, however, I'd like to introduce Lynn Downey. Lynn is an award-winning historian, novelist, and short story writer. Some of you might remember her from her talk that she did at our museum, talk on Levi Strauss, and that was in 2017. She was a company historian for Levi Strauss and Company in San Francisco for 25 years. She also is an authority in the history of the Dude Ranch and published American Dude Ranch and one more book in the last couple of years. Tonight we feature tuberculosis. In the early 20th century, we had 2 facilities for TB within about an hour of Sacramento, one in Weimar, one in Colfax. Colfax had not only a sanatorium, but also a school for the tuberculous. Tonight, Lynn takes us back over 100 years to Marin County, where Dr. Brown opened the Arequipa Sanatorium for particularly women with tuberculosis. Lynn's grandmother was a patient there, which led her to research intensively the sanatorium and write her book in 2019, which has been published, and we will try to carry some copies at the Medical Museum. It's apparently also available on Amazon. Thank you so much, Lynn, for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me back, even though it's virtual. I'm very happy to be talking with the folks at the museum again. And thank you all so much for coming. When I do one of these webinars, I always feel like Gloria Swanson at the end of Sunset Boulevard. You know, all those wonderful people out there in the dark. So all you wonderful people out there, thank you again for coming. Okay, here we go. I grew up in Marin County, in the suburb of Marinwood in the 50s and 60s. And my grandparents lived in Sonoma. And when we used to visit, my grandmother would always tell stories. And she would preface so many of these stories with the sentence, when I was in the sanatorium. When I was in the sanatorium, it was so cold, or the doctors were so wonderful, or on and on and on. And I was a little kid and I didn't really question, what she meant by that. And then in about 1966, I was a 12-year-old Girl Scout. And I went to a day camp called Arequipa. Oh, by the way, Dr. Bob, I gave you the wrong pronunciation of Arequipa. So I went to this day camp called Arequipa, and there was this big brown shingled building on the property. And they let us run in there. We were running down the hallways, and there were old bed frames and tables and weird looking equipment. And we didn't know what this building was, but we thought it was kind of cool. And I was kind of a budding historian, and I thought, oh, this is a very interesting building. And then as I got older, my grandmother kind of stopped telling her stories until the 1980s, when there was a lot of news reports about a resurgence of tuberculosis in the wake of the growing AIDS crisis. And she started telling her stories again when I was in the sanatorium. So I finally said, Grandma, what are you talking about? And she said, oh, well, when your father was 2 years old, I got tuberculosis, and Dr. Brown sent me to Arequipa. The Girl Scout camp? She said, no, dear. No, dear. It was a sanatorium just for women who had tuberculosis. Well, I was flabbergasted. I had no idea. So the next opportunity I had, I sat my grandmother down with a tape recorder and I recorded 2 hours of her memories of her time at the sanatorium. And then I wanted to find out more about this place, but I really couldn't find very much. I went to the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. I went to the Oakland Museum, but I couldn't find much. And then I thought, It's Girl Scout property. Maybe they know something. So I called the Girl Scouts and they said, you need to talk to the site manager. His name is Happy Stanton. So I called this Happy Stanton guy and I told him I was interested in the history of the place. And he said, oh yeah, when I started the job, the building was full of papers and photographs and scrapbooks. And I'm an archivist and I just about had a heart attack. And I said, what did you do with all that stuff? And he said, it all looked pretty important to me. So I saved it all and I put it in a shed on the property. So I made an appointment. I actually happened to be living in Fairfax at the time. And I went to the site and he opened the door and it was the entire archive of this sanatorium. So I strong-armed the Girl Scouts into letting me take everything home, clean it up, and organize it. And by using those materials, I was able to find the story that I'm going to tell you tonight. Arequipa was founded by this man, Dr. Philip King Brown of San Francisco. He founded it in 1911. He opened a sanatorium just for women who had TB, which was incredibly rare. In 1911, there were about 400 sanatoria in the United States, and maybe 3 or 4 of them were for women only. And I thought, what could have led him to want to do this? And the answer became clear very quickly. It was because of this woman, his mother, Dr. Charlotte Blake Brown. Charlotte Blake Brown met her husband in Arizona. They moved to Napa. She very quickly had 3 children. And when they were all under the age of 10, she packed her bags and went to Philadelphia to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania to become a doctor, which had been a goal of hers since she was a child. So she came back to the family in 1874 and they all moved to San Francisco for her to start her practice. She started a practice specializing in the care of women and children. In 1875, she co-founded Children's Hospital, which at the time was called the Pacific Dispensary for Women and Children. She raised her 3 children in San Francisco and she raised them to understand that women deserved health care, the kind of quality health care that men got, that there should be no difference for any of them. And 2 of her children became doctors, her son, Philip, and her daughter, Adelaide. Her 3rd daughter, Harriet, actually married and moved to Boston and got very involved in the women's suffrage movement. So she did a good job raising her kids. And Dr. Brown went to Harvard. He graduated Harvard Medical School in 1890, came back to San Francisco to start his practice, and he married Helen Hillier, also from a San Francisco family. And she was the surrogate daughter of Phoebe Apperson Hearst, who, as you know, the West's greatest philanthropist. So they had a home in San Francisco. He had a thriving practice. Their family was thriving. Their family was growing. Everything was going great until April 18th, 1906. That's their home on Van Ness next to the church, the crumbled church. Actually, the steeple from the church fell through their roof and I think what landed in the dining room. But the house survived the quake, but of course, not the fire. Theirs was one of the houses that was dynamited as a fire break to help stop the fires after the earthquake. But the family was very well off and they were able to get themselves back up and running again. Dr. Brown's practice was also destroyed. He did a lot of relief work after the earthquake and fire and then opened up a practice again. And over the next couple of years, he noticed something interesting. More women than men were coming into his practice with tuberculosis. And almost invariably, they were working women, women who worked in factories, classrooms, department stores, telephone switchboard rooms. And they were having the most TB than any other class of women, and certainly more than men. So he started to think about this and he realized the city is being rebuilt and there is so much dust in the air. There's dust, there's brick dust, God only knows what else flying through the air after all these buildings had burned. And the men were outdoors rebuilding the city. They're out there in the fresh air for the most part, but all of that dust, all of that awful stuff is coming in and filtering in through the windows in these factories and schools and department stores, and it's settling in the corners and it's settling in these women's lungs. And these are working women, so they don't necessarily have a lot of money. They might live in crowded conditions. Their nutrition might be poor. They were so much more at risk for tuberculosis. And he realized that this was a big problem in San Francisco. But there were very few places for these women to go. San Francisco General Hospital had some TB wards, but people were just like chock-a-block in these wards, and there literally were not enough beds for the people who needed them. So he decided he needed to open his own sanatorium. And the whole concept of a sanatorium had only been around since about the 1880s. An American doctor named Edward Livingston Trudeau had himself had tuberculosis and went to the Adirondacks to die and got better, and then came back to New York where he was living. And he realized what he had done is he'd gone to the mountains, he had rested, he'd eaten really good food, and he had managed to revive his health. And at the same time, he was reading some research coming out of Germany in which doctors were sending tubercular people into the mountains to sit outdoors all day, to rest and eat really good food. And they were getting over tuberculosis. Nobody was getting cured, but they were getting over it enough that they could go on with their lives. It began to be called the rest cure. And what the rest cure did, what we know now, is it built up the body's own immunity with rest, with lots of fresh air, and so much food. When you were in a sanatorium, they gave you so much food, it was like they were fattening you up at the county fair. But the whole idea was to build up your body's strength, because one of the symptoms of TB was massive weight loss. So they had to build the body back up. So what happened during this rest cure is something called macrophages would grow around the tubercle bacilli that were in the lung, that were eating away the lungs. It would wall off the infection, and the TB patient would stop having fevers, would no longer be contagious, no danger to themselves or their families or their communities. In 1910, there were 135 deaths per 100,000 people in the United States. And this was an appalling statistic, Dr. Brown. So he decided he was going to open his own sanatorium, and it was only going to be for women. But of course, one thing he needed, of course, was support and money. One of the people who came through for him was Phoebe Apperson Hearst, his wife's surrogate mother, whom he called Aunt Phoebe. And also Dr. Brown, through his mother's social contacts, he knew a lot of women in both Marin and San Francisco, society women who had money, who wanted to fund good causes, that just threw money at him so that he could buy equipment and get all of the supplies that he needed. But he needed two other things. The very first thing he needed was land. And there was a real estate magnate and philanthropist in Marin County named Henry Bothine. And he had mutual friends with Dr. Brown. And through him, he heard about Dr. Brown's desire to build a sanatorium. So he gave him 46 acres in the hills outside of Fairfax in Marin County, in West Marin County, to build his sanatorium. And again, a lot of other women gave him, money and buy his equipment. And he also hired famed architect John Bakewell to design the plans for the building. Bakewell was half of the firm of Bakewell and Brown, who designed the post-1906 City Hall in San Francisco. He designed this beautiful structure and donated the plans to Dr. Brown so he wouldn't have to pay for the plans. So Arequipa, the main building, is right here in the middle of this photograph. It opened in September of 1911. Now the name is very interesting. Dr. Brown and his wife had a house in Santa Barbara, and they had a neighbor, and there is actually Montecito, and they had a neighbor, a man named Price Mitchell, who had been a sea captain on steamers that went around Central and South America at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. So he retired, and he and his wife bought a house, or built a house next door to the Browns in Santa Barbara. And he named his house Arequipa because it was the name of his favorite ship. And he told Dr. Brown at some point that it was actually an indigenous Peruvian word that meant place of rest. And when Dr. Brown heard that, he knew that would be, that was the perfect name for a sanatorium, a place for people to go to take the rest cure. So from the beginning, all of the staff was women. This is a photo of a sadly unidentified nurse at Arequipa from the early 20th century or the early 1920s. Pardon me. So all the nurses, of course, were women, and they did live on the property. But doctors there was sort of this rotating list of visiting physicians who would come from San Francisco to do their rounds at the sanatorium. And in the beginning, they were all women. One of them was Dr. Emma Willits, who got her MD at Northwestern and then moved to San Francisco to work at Charlotte's Children's Hospital. Another was Dr. Ethel Owen, who was one of the first women to get an MD degree at Stanford. And she went to France during World War I to serve as a physician there and was decorated by the French government for her service. And another was Philip's sister Adelaide, Dr. Adelaide Brown. Her mission in life was to clean up the milk in San Francisco, especially the milk that was served to school children, because cows can get bovine tuberculosis, and that can, whoever drinks that milk can get TB from drinking that milk. And Adelaide Brown thought this was appalling. So she worked really hard, especially after the earthquake and fire, to make sure that the milk in San Francisco was clean. And she did the same thing at Arequipa, because in the early years, they had their own dairy. So she inspected those cows, she inspected that milk, because those women had to drink 3, I believe, gigantic glasses of milk a day as part of the rest cure. So she made sure it was clean and those women were getting safe milk to drink. Now, Dr. Brown also knew that these women are lying in bed in the sanatorium, and what's going through their mind? Oh my God, I'm going to die. What's going to happen to my children? He didn't use this word, but he understood what stress can do, emotional stress can do to the body when you're trying to heal yourself of an illness. So, like many other institutions did, he created a program of occupational therapy, and he chose pottery. And he built a pottery shed on the property. He hired 3 famous ceramic masters to teach the women to make bowls and vases and eventually ceramic tile. Now, only the women who were on their way to being discharged were allowed to work in the pottery. Because if you were still had a fever and you weren't gaining weight, it meant you were infectious and you had to stay in bed. It was called rest cure for a reason. But for example, the women in this photograph, they were fever-free, they'd been gaining weight. And so they were allowed to spend a few hours every day in the pottery shed, forming clay, decorating clay. They would sit outdoors and decorate the pottery. And there was a kiln on the property that would fire the pieces. And so this was occupational therapy so that they could have something to occupy their mind. But Dr. Brown took it one step further. He went to the department stores, the high-end department stores of San Francisco, like the White House and the Emporium. And he said, look, these women are making this very simple but beautiful pottery. I want you to carry these pieces on your shelves, and a portion of the sales will go back to the patients themselves so that they can help pay for their stay. Now, Arequipa was a very inexpensive, very affordable place. It was $1 a day, and that covered everything. But even for some women, that was hard. But by allowing these women to sell their pieces of pottery that they made, he literally put their cure in their own hands. And department stores were so happy to help. And they would tell customers the story. If you buy this vase, it's going to help a woman get over tuberculosis. And it was a wonderful program. So Dr. Brown really wanted to get the word out. And when the Panama Pacific International Exposition opened in San Francisco, Arequipa had a booth. I wish I knew what happened to those beautiful banners that were in that booth because they disappeared. But anyway, he hired discharged patients who'd had some facility at the pottery to come back, make pottery in the booth, show everybody how everybody at Arequipa did this kind of work, and they would sell the pieces and the money would go to help pay for supplies at Arequipa. Dr. Brown put charts all over the wall showing the cure rates for the women who worked in the pottery. And it was a really great way to get the word out. And again, it continued to bring notice to the pots so that when women or people went into the stores, they would be sure to buy one at the White House or at the Emporium. So the whole idea from the beginning was that people needed to have fresh air coming into their lungs at all times. And there was a concept in the early 20th century called the outdoor life. And it was this way of living would help prevent tuberculosis as well as help you get healed from it. So Dr. Brown instructed John Bakewell to make sure to design Arequipa with these balconies. And the nurses would drag beds out on the balconies, and these women would lie on these beds all day out in the fresh air. And you'll notice what looks like windows in this building. Those are windows, but that is not glass. The entire sanatorium was screened. The only glass, I believe, was in like the bathrooms and the kitchen. And that way there was fresh air coming into this building 365 days a year, every season of the year, again, to make sure that fresh air was circulating. There was an entire magazine devoted called the Journal of the Outdoor Life, and it was aimed at doctors, and it was also aimed at people who had recovered from TB but wanted to continue, to make sure that they lived right after they left, because that was the point, was to learn how to take care of yourself. So you're resting in bed, and you're eating all the food they're throwing at you, and you're getting all your fresh air, but you're still not making progress. So when that happened, there were some rather ghastly medical interventions that they would do for you at Arequipa. One of them was called pneumothorax. You would lie on a table on your stomach, and they would slap some anesthetic on your back, and then there's a hose on this machine with a needle on the end, and they would stick the needle in your back through your ribs and fill the pleural cavity around your lung with nitrogen to artificially collapse the lung. And they would always do this on the lung that was the most affected, had the most bacilli. And that way the lung wouldn't work at all, again, allowing those macrophages to form to wall off the tubercle bacilli. So of course it meant you were only breathing, with one lung. So it wasn't a pleasant experience. And eventually the nitrogen would leave your body. And some women had to have this done multiple times until that lung really got better. And there were even more drastic ones. There was one with an unpronounceable name, Dr. Bob, you can help me here, thoracoplasty, where the women would be sent to a hospital and have a rib removed so that the lung was collapsed permanently. But that was very rare. A lot of women did have the pneumothorax, which was pretty common and not as horrifying and invasive as it sounds. There also were women got a lot of x-rays. I don't know how these women did not glow in the dark after they left Arequipa. They got so many x-rays, but it was a really good tool to help understanding to see the progress of a cure. In the early years, Arequipa was clean, it was sterile, and visitors could come in. You could have your friends and family come and visit. People would come and visit all the time, sit on your bed and talk to you while you were in bed. It was the kind of place that was like the safest place to be to protect yourself from tuberculosis, because it had everything necessary to get people cured, and it meant you weren't going to catch it when you were there either. So in the early years, I found this photograph on eBay. It's just a bunch of people came and visited their friends at Arequipa. And this is about 1915. And that was very, very common. So after World War I, the pottery had to close. It was just so expensive to buy the clay, and it was really expensive to buy, and also the pottery machinery. It was really expensive to keep ceramic masters on staff to teach the women. And it just became untenable and wasn't really helping the women as much as Dr. Brown had hoped, but he really believed in occupational therapy. So after he closed the pottery, he offered laboratory technology, as you see at the top photo, and women learned stenography, typing, all kinds of secretarial skills, and many women left Arequipa with new careers. They didn't have to go back to that factory or back to that department store. So one of Dr. Brown's favorite phrases was, Arequipa is a school, kind of like the Colfax School for the Tuberculous. It was a place for women to learn, first of all, why they got TB in the first place, and to learn how to take care of themselves and follow the rules in the sanatorium, and then how to take care of themselves when they left. Because he would always say, I don't want to see you come back here again. So there was a huge educational process that went on, as well as the rest cure that was healing the body. And so there were informal lectures and there were very formal lectures about what to do. And Dr. Brown would talk about what was going on in the world and going on in culture to help the women understand about how to prevent TB. For one thing, they just railed against the flapper lifestyle when the 20s, when the jazz age came along, the staying out late and smoking and drinking too much. Although he did say that the looser flapper dresses were better for breathing than wearing corsets. He thought women should just not wear corsets at all. And then in 1922, the San Francisco Chronicle interviewed Dr. Brown, and he gave this very interesting quote to the reporter. Short skirts do not sweep up germ-laden dirt from the streets. And that way they are an aid in the prevention of disease. So fashion has its place in the prevention of disease. Dr. Brown also encouraged his patients to put together an in-house newsletter, and that was very common. Almost every sanatorium had its own magazine or newsletter, because building community And encouraging each other was one way, really a very important part of the cure as well. Bonds were formed in places like this that sometimes stayed for life. And the women encouraged each other in their cure. So this is a page from one of the 3 different newsletters that were created at Arequipa. It was called The High Life. And you'll see right in the middle on the right-hand side, there's a very heavy woman, and she's, she's so heavy, the bench has fallen over. Well, she's in good shape because that means she has gained weight and she's getting better. And the poor skinny woman on the left, well, she's got a ways to go. She's got to put on some weight. And then up at the top, there's one of the dear nurses. Ethel Steves was one of the favorite nurses of everybody. And she's thinking about Arequipa while she's on vacation in Waikiki. And then a drawing of Dr. Brown on the left, who always apparently liked to have a piece of apple pie when he came by on his visits to the sanatorium. So this was a way that, to keep the women's minds occupied, give them something creative to do. And again, that building of community and mutual support, which was also very important to the second oldest Brown child, Cabot Brown, was the only one to go on to become a doctor and follow in his father's footsteps. This is Cabot Brown. He also went to Harvard Medical School. He graduated in 1927, came back to San Francisco and joined his father's practice, and decided to do pulmonary work as his career. And so he began to make regular visits to Arequipa. Also in 1927, a young mother in Sonoma named Lynn Downey, my grandmother, came down with tuberculosis. That's my toddler father at the time. This is 1927. She came down with TB. Her doctor told her, you need to rest. He was trying to sort of give her the rest cure at home. You need to rest. You need to get a lot of sleep, sit outdoors, eat good food. Well, she had a toddler at home. My grandfather was working all day. Her in-laws lived next door and they did what they could, but she couldn't get the rest that she needed. She just wasn't improving and she was getting worse and worse. So her doctor said to my grandparents, she needs to go to a sanatorium. And they said, oh my God, we can't afford this. My grandfather was a troubleshooter for PG&E. They were working people, working class. And her doctor said, no, it was very affordable. I want you to see Dr. Philip King Brown. So they made an appointment, and my grandmother actually packed a suitcase that day. And they went to San Francisco and just saw Dr. Brown himself at his offices. He looked her over, he took x-rays, and then he took my grandfather in the other room. He said, look, your wife might have 3 months left to live. And we just can't take patients in that critical of a state at a sanatorium. For one thing, the rest cure doesn't always work for women like this, and it's demoralizing for the other patients if somebody dies. And so my grandfather said, would you please just take her for 3 months? And if she doesn't improve in 3 months, I'll take her home to die. And Dr. Brown broke his own rule. And she had that suitcase, and he sent her to Arequipa that very day. And she began to improve almost immediately. And those 3 months went by, and she was on her way to a cure. And she eventually was at Arequipa for 14 months and was able to leave in February of 1929. And when she was there, Dr. Cabot Brown was her doctor. Now, Dr. Philip King Brown, his father, was a warm and compassionate person, but he wasn't very approachable. He was very reserved. Cabot Brown, when he walked into the ward at Arequipa, it was like somebody had unleashed a golden retriever who was just bounding through the ward, making everybody smile. He had this buoyant, wonderful personality that everybody loved. And Grandma loved him. She thought he was just the greatest thing. And he believed in having that kind of positive attitude. He believed that accrued, healing to his patients. He had a great sense of humor. In February of 1928, there was a smallpox outbreak in Oakland, and Cabot Brown came to Arequipa to inoculate anyone who had not been inoculated against smallpox, and my grandmother had not. So in those days, they just had like a little needle and they would just scratch her arm. So she's in bed and he scratches her arm. And she says, well, I better do it another time just for good measure. And the next day, her arm it was huge and swollen and throbbing and horrible. So the next time he came to Arequipa, he'd heard about this. He walked up to her bed and he said, so when are you going to sue me for what happened to your arm? So that was the kind of personality that he had. And she really credited him with helping her get through the process of coming out on the other end and leaving in this condition in February of 1929, completely, well, apparently cured is what they call it. Now, before she left, Cabot Brown sat her down. He said, if you go back to the same living conditions and the same attitude, towards your life that you had when you got sick, you will come back here. And I don't want to see you come back here. And she really, really took his advice to heart, as I'll talk about in just a few minutes. So Dr. Cabot Brown started taking on more of the medical director activities. Dr. Philip Brown was working on some other projects. One of his big, one of the things that was most important to him was universal health care in like 1938. And he worked with the legislature in Sacramento to try to pass universal health care for Californians. It did not, but that was something that at the end of his life, he was very, very dedicated. But what Cabot Brown decided to do was hire a few more male physicians. And there was one in particular he wanted. And with his father's blessing, Dr. Cabot Brown started admitting girls to Arequipa, because children were getting TB, children were at risk for tuberculosis. And it was very hard to get, the rest cure for kids. So this is Dr. Lloyd Dickey, who was a San Francisco pediatrician. He became one of the visiting physicians at Arequipa in order to help these younger people with the challenges of childhood and getting over tuberculosis. And one of those children that he helped take care of was a young girl named Rose, who at age 14 in 1940 was admitted to Arequipa. She was third generation Chinese American, born in San Francisco and raised in Watsonville. She had a number of brothers and sisters. Her father was a seasonal fruit picker, wasn't home a lot. And when she was 13, Rose's mother died of TB. And a few months later, an eagle-eyed teacher noticed some troubling symptoms in Rose and had her examined by a doctor, where they discovered that she had virulent tuberculosis. She was in grave danger. And luckily, her doctor knew about Arequipa and arranged for her to get admitted to Arequipa in 1940, again, when she was 14 years old. I love this photograph. I call this the United Nations photograph. That's Rose in the back row, second from right. What this photo shows is one of the other amazing and unique qualities of Arequipa, which is that there was no racial discrimination in patients. I asked that question specifically to my grandmother. She said, no, it didn't matter what color you were. If you needed a bed, you got a bed. So during Rose's time, these were some of her friends. There are Anglo-American, Asian American, and Hispanic American girls in this photograph. And they were all her friends. And they were their own little cadre. And many of them stayed close for years after they all left Arequipa. And that is a very important part of the Arequipa story. Rose herself ended up staying at Arequipa for 7 years, 5 of them as a patient. Cabot Brown was determined that Rose was not going to die of TB. And there was another doctor on staff, Dr. Thomas Wiper, and he and Cabot just conspired to make sure that Rose did not die. And after about 5 years, she really was apparently cured and ready to go home, but she had nowhere to go. Her mother was dead. Her father was, out and unavailable. All of her siblings had married and moved away. So they gave her a home at the sanatorium. They found a room for her and they gave her a job. She answered the phone. She swept the floors. Dr. Brown taught her how to analyze samples in the lab. And when she was 21, she felt ready to go back out into the world. And she went to work for Dr. Wiper at his sanatorium in Belmont. And after a few years, she really did feel ready to rejoin the real world. And she married and went into government service after all of those years at 2 sanatoriums, but the quality years, of course, at Arequipa. Dr. Philip King Brown died in October of 1940, and Cabot fully took over as medical director of the sanatorium. He made a lot of changes. And one of the things that he did was to change the sanatorium from the kind of place where, your family could come and visit. And it was, if you got up out of bed and moved around, it was okay, to a very rigid hospital-like structure. And he changed the admission procedure. When you first went in and when you were sick, you went into one wing. You got no visitors, nothing. And you did not move. You did not get out of that bed. You stayed in bed all the time. And as your cure progressed, you got to move to different wings until you were in a final wing where you were about ready to be discharged and you could see your family. I started doing research on Arequipa in about 1984. And I managed to track down 2 former patients who'd been there in the 1950s. And one of them told me that until she went into that last wing, the only way she could see her husband and children was to lean out the window and wave at them when they were at the patio below. And Dr. Brown, Cabot Brown, felt that was really, really important. And he was probably right. It was especially for those who were newly admitted that were so contagious and so sick. It was best to keep them separated from everybody else and have these different tiers of healing levels before people left the sanatorium. And in the 1950s, these mobile x-ray trucks used to go around to rural areas. If you didn't have a doctor who had an x-ray in your town, or you didn't have a doctor in your town at all, these trucks would come and you would get a free chest x-ray. And then in a few days, you'd get a letter telling you the results. And if the results looked a little troubling, you'd be advised to go see a doctor, and you'd be given the name and location of a doctor who would specialize in pulmonary diseases. And all of this was funded by the National Association for the Prevention of Tuberculosis, which became the American Lung Association eventually. And so this was happening in the early 1950s, but something else had started happening in the late 40s. In 1944, I believe, streptomycin was discovered. All kinds of drugs had been tried to try to kill the bacilli, and nothing worked until they discovered streptomycin. It's like, oh my gosh, it's a miracle cure. The first patient who received streptomycin at Arequipa was in 1947. But what doctors realized very quickly was that the bacilli developed antibiotic resistance to streptomycin. There was another drug that came out of Scandinavia called PAS, also very promising, same problem, antibiotic resistance. But when either one of these was combined with another drug called isoniazid, it became the magic bullet that doctors were hoping for. It was very rare instances of antibiotic resistance, and it would just go in there and power out and kill those bacilli. And it changed everything for doctors, for patients, for American culture. Sanatoria started to close. Admissions dropped because you could get a pill at your doctor's office, or you could take a pill at home. And doctors still advise people to make sure to take care of themselves and all of that. But there was this pill, and the sanatorium very slowly but eventually became obsolete, which of course, was good news. Now, Dr. Cabot Brown knew this was great, knew that the new drugs were a miracle and it was wonderful. But he really believed in the rest cure. He really did. And even when he sent his patients home with pills, he would still tell them, be sure to get enough rest and eat good food. And in about 1952 or so, Life magazine had a story about the new drugs and about how sanatoria were closing. And it had a photograph of a bunch of women in bathrobes dancing down the hallway because they got to leave the sanatorium. They could, go to their doctor's office and get some drugs. And one of the patients that I talked to said, she showed this article to Dr. Cabot Brown, and he looked at it and he sniffed and he's like, well, they were my patients. They would dance right back to bed. But he knew what was coming. He saw the writing on the wall. There were about 5 patients left at Arequipa by 1957. And he arranged for them to either go home and be taken care of at home or to other sanatoria that were still open. And he closed Arequipa in 1957. Now, by that time, there were only 8 deaths per 100,000 cases, as opposed to 1910, where it was 135. So that's so significant and is such a testament to the hard work and sacrifice that went into not only giving the rest cure to so many people for so many years, but of course the struggle to find, just that magic bullet and that right drug. So after Arequipa closed, a group that gave services to disabled adults and children took over the property for about 3 years. And then the Girl Scouts took over the property in 1960, which is why when I went there in 1966, it was still a day camp, and it still is. It's still the Arequipa Girl Scout camp. So after I interviewed my grandmother, I took her back to Arequipa. And she walked into the building, and she walked down a hall, turned a corner, and pointed at a bed frame and said, that's where my bed was. And in this photo, she's 79 years old. And as I said, Cabot Brown told her what to do when she got home, how to keep from getting TB again. And she took that advice to heart. She became a health nut. In 1970, when Dr. Linus Pauling published his book about the health benefits of vitamin C, She kept buckets of vitamin C in her cupboards, had buckets of every possible vitamin. She went to a Seventh-day Adventist healer. She exercised all the time, and she never relapsed. She never got TB again, and she lived to be 102 years old. And to the end of her life, she credited Arequipa for not only curing her tuberculosis, but teaching her how to live for the rest of her life. Now, I'm able to tell you Rose's story because I got to meet her, and it's the most amazing story. I was working on my book in the spring of 2018, and I got an email from a doctor in New York. He said, I used to practice medicine at George Washington Hospital in Washington, D.C. And I had this patient, her name was Rose, and she used to tell me these stories about this California TB sanatorium she was in called Arequipa. And I saw he had Googled all of this, and he found me because I'd published a number of articles about Arequipa over the years. And so that's how he found me. And I said, oh my God, that's an amazing story. And he said, well, I've kept in touch with Rose, and she's 91 years old. And would you like to talk to her? Oh my God, of course I would. So he gave me her phone number, and I called her up, and we had a 2-hour phone conversation. I was frantically taking notes. She was sharper than I was. She remembered everything that happened to her at Arequipa. She had stories about the doctors. She had stories about her friends. That was her photo, the United Nations photo. That was one of her photographs that she let me use for the book. I was so lucky because I had enough time to put her story into the book. And then in August of 2018, I went to Washington to meet her. And she was so special to me in my life. It was like having my grandmother back. I mean, you can't tell in this photo, but her lipstick pink matched the pink of the flowers on her. She was phenomenal. And we spoke 2 or 3 times a week for the next 3 years. And I would pick up the phone, and it would be her, and she'd say, hello. She was invariably positive and funny. And she passed in January of 2021 at the age of 95. And I still miss her. She was incredibly special. And her story is so important. It's such an important part of the Arequipa story. So I was very lucky to have her in my life. So Arequipa continues to be a gift to me. I've also gotten to know the descendants of Dr. Philip King Brown and Dr. Cabot Brown. They're friends of mine. Some live here in the Bay Area, some live in Washington. And so that's a continuing gift for me. But the real gift was what with 3 generations of Drs. Brown gave to the working women of San Francisco. Hundreds and hundreds of women went through Arequipa and came out whole. Not everybody did, but most of them did. And they went on to, again, learn how to take care of themselves and not get TB again. And their lives were changed because of this little place in Marin County. They were the most vulnerable of women in San Francisco. And so they survived tuberculosis because of this family. And it's been my privilege all of these years to be able to tell their story. And I want to thank you for coming and listening to me tonight and giving me the chance to talk about them, because I think it's an incredible story and is so very, very special to me. So with that, I will say thank you and move on to the shameless self-promotion portion of the evening. If you'd like a copy of my book, it's on Amazon or bookshop.org. If you'd like a signed copy, just go to the contact page on my website. Maybe Sam can just put that in the chat and send me an email. And we will work it out, and I'll send you a signed copy. So thank you again so much for coming. And I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat or use the Q&A function. I'm going to pull up your website real quick and drop that link. One second here.
It's easy. It's lynndowney.com.
There is that.
And you're welcome to everybody who's saying thank you in the chat. Yes, Ellen, I was so lucky to have these great pictures. Some are from my family. Some are from the annual reports. Arequipa put annual reports out every year, and they were full of photographs. So those were, just amazing to be able to use in the book. What percentage of patients had to undergo some of the therapeutics? I don't know an exact percentage. The question is how many women had to go through that horrible procedure. I would say the majority of women did have to do pneumothorax. It was so common that even if you just had just a little bit of a problem, with one of your lungs, they would do the pneumothorax. My grandmother had it a couple of times. And she said it was not pleasant. The really drastic ones, like the removing the rib, I don't think that happened very often. But pneumothorax was considered, one of the sort of part of the rescue.
We do have a pneumothorax unit in the medical museum. It's very attractive. It's all like mahogany, solid
Oh
wood.
my.
And I'll get a photograph of that up on our website, along with a few other things about TB in the near future.
There's a wonderful book written by, oh gosh, what's her name? It's just gone completely out of my head. It's called The Plague and I. One of the names for tuberculosis was the White Plague. And it's the woman who wrote the book, The Egg and I, that was made into a movie with Fred McMurray and Claudette Colbert. But it's called The Plague and I. And it's her story about getting TB and going to a sanatorium in Washington State. And it's, she's a very funny writer. It's like laugh out loud funny in a lot of the places, but also it's so much of what she talked about in her memoir mirrors what my grandmother went through and mirrors what a lot of other patients have told me as well. So if you're interested in another story, The Plague and I by whatever her name is, it's just gone right out of my head.
Is it Betty McDonald?
Betty McDonald, yes.
Well, thank you so much, Lynn, for sharing your evening with us.
Thank you so much.
Fascinating, well-researched talk, and very, very informative.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate everybody out there in the dark. Any opportunity I get to tell this story is gold for me. So I very, very much appreciate it. Thank you all so much. Oops. Oh, we're getting more info here. What's this? Florida. Eek. Wow. Well, they were everywhere. I think there were sanatorium in almost every single state.
Well, thank you again. And we really appreciate, you being here with us this evening. Thank you, everybody, for signing on.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good night.
Good night.